The Second World War, a podcast by Stephen Bedard.
In this episode of the Second World War podcast, I have the privilege of speaking with Mark Aedy. And Mark, welcome to the podcast, and was hoping you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write the book that we're going to be talking about.
Well, Stephen, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the book. I fear it's my father, Ken Aedy, that deserves the credit for writing the book, because it's effectively his memoirs, which he committed to paper in the late 90s before he finally faded away in November 2001. The only credit I can claim, or my sister and I can claim, is that we published it on the 29th of May this year, when Dad would have been 100, at the Royal Air Force Club in Piccadilly, which was great fun, and we had a big party to celebrate. And but the credit for the narrative and the story is all due to Dad.
Well, and he does a great job of it. I'm sure that you had to clean things up a little bit to get it ready for publication. And sometimes, in some ways, that's as much work as putting the words down in the first place.
Well, do you know, it's been a joy. I'm 65 now, and when my father faded away, I was in my early 40s. And of course, I said with immense confidence, oh, I'm going to publish it. I'm going to get it sorted out. It's only, Stephen, taken me 23 years. But the last couple of years have been an absolute joy, because what happened when Dad finally faded away, my dear wife, Deanne, asked Dad to commit to paper. She literally said, could you put on a couple of pieces of paper what you did in the war? And Dad smiled quietly. He was really quite unwell then, and said, well, I will. And literally the night he died in November 2001, my mum asked me to pop upstairs to his office, because she thought he had written something down. And on a hand-crank computer like this, I printed off 90 pages of close type. But it was a bit erratic, and Dad's typing wasn't world-class. But also, he refers throughout the narrative that covers his time in the Royal Air Force from 42 up to 73, but particularly 42 to the late 50s. He refers to an awful lot of things where, if you don't have some sort of context, you know, you read it and go, gosh, I wish I knew more. So Operation Man and the dropping of food supplies to the Dutch, the return of Allied prisoners of war, the Potsdam raid, the transition onto fast jets, etc. So over the last couple of years, through great help from White Fox, a publishing company in London, helped me assemble a picture collator, a painting collator, a book designer. And I also appointed a wonderful woman called Catherine Chapman, a 20-year-old second-year undergrad at Durham University, my old university, which I went to 100 years ago. And she was the one who's collated all the extra additional information and references to give Dad's story more narrative. So it's been a joy. You cannot believe the fun I've had doing it, but also the kindness that I've experienced on the way. I'll give you one example. Dad was taught to fly in Oklahoma, in Ponca City, Oklahoma, in 1943. And the woman in Ponca City Library has been unbelievably helpful, and even found magazines that Dad has referred to in from 1943. I mean, how crazy is that? I've just had loads of serendipity and good fortune putting it together. And I just hope it's done Dad's narrative justice.
Well, I think that it does. And the book that we're talking about is From Biplanes to Fast Jets, A Pilot's Life in the Royal Air Force, 1942 to 1973. And I would say, as I started reading the book, I loved the narrative. But it's also a beautiful book. The pictures that are in here, and the paintings and the posters and all of the other things that are provided in this. This is a real treasure. It really got me into the narrative to have those extra helps of being able to picture in our minds what these things look like, the royalty that he meets, and even the movie stars, and so
Yeah.
it
Crazy.
just was really it really is a beautiful book.
Well, that's so kind of you to say that. You can imagine. I guess I'm only going to publish my father's memoirs once, so I thought I'd give it the best shot. And as I say, the people from the RAF Museum, the United States Air Force Museum, people in various museums in Holland have been incredibly helpful. So it's just been great fun. But I guess if you're going to do it, you might as well give it a good go. So it's so kind of you to say that.
Yeah, I think that he'd be very proud of the final result for sure. Now, the book covers his career in the RAF from World War II and beyond. Could you talk to us a little bit about what motivated him to join the RAF in the first place?
He joined in 1942, by which time Britain had been under siege effectively for a long time. But in the book, he describes even at age 15 in 1939 being excited by the war, and his enthusiasm, and all his buddies in Torquay and Devon being equally excited to join up. I find that now pretty astonishing, but he was, first of all, he was very motivated to do his bit. All his friends were doing their bit and wanted to contribute. But the other thing is he acquired an affection, a love for flying very early on. So he joined the Air Squadron at Southampton University in 42. I hope this cricket analogy is not lost on you, Stephen, but if you're a cricket fanatic, he had his medical to join the Royal Air Force in the long room at Lord's, which is the sacred hallowed ground, the head of English cricket, which is ironic because my dad was a cricket nut. And then very quickly in March, got on a converted Queen Elizabeth Cunard liner, converted to a troop ship, and sailed to New Brunswick, and then took the train for 4 days from New Brunswick via New York to Oklahoma to fly. And I think he thought he was just A, making a contribution, but B, I think he had just a great fun time apart from the hairy moments that he endured in operations.
One of the things I appreciated in the book, we sometimes get the impression from watching movies that people join up and then the next thing you know, they're flying a plane in combat, maybe a few weeks later. It actually took quite a while for his training to be complete. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It really strikes one when you read the narrative, and indeed, when I go through his extraordinary logbook, bearing in mind the casualty rate in Bomber Command, you'd almost think everybody would be fast-tracked. But Dad was his first flying lesson in Oklahoma in Polka City was on the 1st of April 43. He went solo on the 12th of April 43. But in the balance of 43 and throughout the whole of 44, he transitioned on to having done Stearman's and Harvard's. He came back to UK, transitioned to Oxford's, which meant he was destined for heavy bombers. And he spent the bulk of 44 learning on Wellingtons, which had been operational, but were then becoming training planes. So he only became operational in early 45. And that meant he had a good 18 months of solid training. And I think the Royal Air Force deserves great credit for that, because obviously piloting that, particularly with a total crew of 7 in a Lancaster that he flew operationally, you sort of had to know what you were doing. But you're right, films tend to make you think they go solo and suddenly they're operational. It was nothing like that. And it took a lot of time and a lot of training, a lot of patience. And I think Dad would probably argue quite a bit of luck.
I know from some of the other reading that I've done that later on in the war, when the Germans were not able to have that lengthy training, and they had to get pilots up in the air as soon as possible, that at that point they ended up started losing more pilots to accidents than they did to combat, because they were rushing them into the cockpit long before they were ready, because they had no other choice. So I'm glad that the RAF, at least at that point, had the opportunity to get proper training.
Yeah. Look, you raise an interesting point, Stephen, on about accidents in training. Dad refers in the book to people lost when planes were being produced extraordinarily quickly, and occasionally the odd bolt here and there wasn't put in the right place. So he lost people training. He rather graphically describes when he was being taught to fly in Oklahoma, an American colleague of his, also a trainee pilot, not handling, coming out of a stall properly and crashing into the ground. And would you believe the trainers, who were effectively bush pilots, wheeled the crash aeroplane out in front of the crew room to make everybody concentrate about paying attention to what they were taught. But he goes on after the war on the transition to fast jets. Those jets were very early stage, and he talks about 9 Hawker Hunters going up, fog covering the northern part of England, not having appropriate radar to land in fog, and all 9 crashing, killing the pilots. So I think it was obviously very dangerous in the operation in the Second World War, but it wasn't without danger subsequently.
That's right. I'm not going to spoil it because I want people to buy the book, but there was a few examples that you give that I went and told people, you won't believe what I just read, and some of the tragic stories of what happened to people, whether pilots or ground crew, in terrible accidents.
Yeah.
Based on your father's memoirs, what do you think it took to be a successful RAF pilot?
Gosh, I can almost see Dad wanting to get in front of me to answer this question. Look, we've touched on the first thing, the most important thing. There was a hell of a lot of training. 18 months. He chuckles in the book about it was great being taught to fly in Oklahoma, but there was a slight problem: was the weather was always good, the sky was always blue, and as flat as a pancake. He comes back to be operational in Europe, and there's sort of lumps and hills and mountains and dreadful weather. But a lot of technical training. That's point one. A hell of a lot of patience. I mean, you'll have noticed even there are periods of considerable inactivity, traveling to various places, doing square bashing as a young tyro, etc. It's quite amusing talking about being taught to march by Jack London, who was the heavyweight champion of the UK at the time. A lot of patience. I think Dad, more seriously, would look you in the eye and say, quite a lot of luck. And in 2 dimensions, if you marginally screwed up your training, and he talks about the need to do a 3-point landing in a Tiger Moth in Oklahoma and subsequently in the UK, if you screwed that up, you got what was called washed up and sent back to Canada, interestingly enough, to become a navigator or another member of the crew. And of course, Dad was so determined to be a pilot. That was a permanent cause of concern, and I think he thought he was lucky quite often that he did manage that 3-point landing or didn't bend the aeroplane. But the other thing is, I think he would argue he was very lucky that he caught the end of the war, where the casualty rate had diminished quite a bit. He still had his moments. He had his instruments shot out by a Messerschmitt 262, which right at the end of the war in April 45, when and that was the first operational jet in any jurisdiction. And he, in one of the call reports he does, he talks about when did you engage with the enemy? He said at 400 yards and 100 yards. So I think he felt pretty lucky that he managed to avoid anything too serious. there is an amusing element to this, but like an instrument shot out, is it damaged navigation. So Dad was 20 when the war finished. It's unconscionable that, my kids are all much older than that now. But he tells an amusing story where he had an argument with his navigator because they had to fly back with the stars. And Dad and the navigator, and